Anyway, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kishore Mahbubani. I'm the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. It gives me great pleasure to invite you to this public lecture by Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia at our school. Now, many of you know that whenever I make my introductory remarks, I make 3 points. So my 3 points today are: number one, I'll try to say why the topic is important. Number two, easiest part, why the speaker is very important. And number three, why it's important for the school to have such events. So first of all, on the topic, the key point I want to emphasize is that the world has changed dramatically. You know, I say that before, when you used to live in 193 separate countries, it was like living in 193 separate boats. You needed rules to make sure the boats didn't collide. Now we no longer live in 193 separate boats. We live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat, but with no captain or crew to take care of the boat as a whole. And that's why the world is floundering. And frankly, that's how the G20 came about. The moment, I guess the one moment when the G20 really did a great job for the world was at the London summit in April 2009, when all the world leaders sensed that the global economy was going over a cliff. They rushed to London, pulled the global economy back, and in many ways saved the world. The big question is, what will the G20 do going forward? And that's why we are very fortunate to have Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia here to address the topic. So let me explain why the speaker is very important. Now, as you all know, this is of course no secret, the Goldman Sachs projections show that by 2050 or earlier, the number one economy in the world will be China, the number two economy in the world will be India, number three economy in the world will be United States of America. And of course, when historians write about the great rise of India, they of course will have to talk about the heroic partnership between Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. So he has actually changed the course of history in the course of his long career with the Indian government. He began in Oxford, was a Rhodes Scholar, brilliant economist, came back, served with the Indian government, spent some time in the World Bank, and in the last few years, frankly, has been the leading player in India's economic management. And in that sense, I must say, it's very fortunate to have him at this point in time, because when you're sitting in my office, I said, Montek, do you mind if I just show this Economist cover? It says how India is losing its magic. So I said, Montek, we want to give you a chance to respond to the Economist. So you will see him also talk about prospects for India. Now, finally, let me say briefly why it's actually very important for the school to have events like this, talks like this, because frankly, at a time when the world is trying to figure out where to go, what to do, lots of people are asking, when are the Asians going to step forward and provide thought leadership on where the world is going, how we reform global governance institutions, how we create a better and more stable world order. Frankly, more and more people are coming to ask the question in Asia. By the way, just today I had a big debate in our school with Giles Merritt, the chairman of the Friends of Europe think tank, and he says, I've come to Asia to find out where Asians have got answers to the global challenges. And here, fortunately, if you want to look for a good Asian answer to the great global challenges, there's no better man to answer it than Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. So with that, Montek, can I give you the floor? Thank you.
Thank you, Kishore. And let me just say it's a great pleasure to be here at the LKY School and talk about a subject that looked quite simple, but now he's added that I have to explain the economist's cover, so I'm sort of trying to structure my remarks in a manner where I can fit that in naturally. Now, what Dean Mahbubani has said is that he wants me to speak for about half an hour, and then we have a little bit of interaction. So what I'd like to do is to divide my remarks into three different parts. I mean, one is really the challenges before the G20 is really the state of the global economy, which is not in good shape. And I will talk a little bit about why that's so and why that's also complicated. And exactly how to handle it is not very clear. I will then talk briefly about what the G20 can do in addressing this challenge. But since my conclusion is going to be that the G20 is actually an important institutional development in the sense it's a democratization of the old G8, but it is still a work in progress. So don't expect miracles to happen in the next 2 or 3 years, which means that each of us have to address the challenges as best we can, while of course wishing the G20 well. And in that context, I want to talk about how would India address these challenges, among which is the business of giving a more balanced perspective on India's prospects than the economist cover suggests. So with that structure, let me just say that as far as the global economy is concerned, I think Kishore put it very well, that in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the enormous financial crisis, it was necessary, A, for all the global leaders to get together and speak in the same voice, and B, to be willing to do some of the things necessary in terms of providing the funding needed for the International Monetary Fund to be able to address some of these problems. And I think that the G20 did very well in that. I'm not going into the history of the G20. I think you know all about that. But it is interesting, by the way, just as a side diversion, the G20 was actually set up in the aftermath of the East Asian crisis, but it was set up at the finance ministers level. And it's very interesting to ask, why was it set up at the finance ministers level when there was already a finance ministers forum, which is the IMFC, i.e. all the finance ministers on the board of the IMF. And I think the principal reason, it was set up after the meeting in Vancouver, the East Asian, whatever, the summit, or the Asia Summit, Asia-Pacific Summit. And it was set up separate from the IMFC because the IMF had lost all credibility in Asia. So the whole idea that if you're going to handle the crisis, the idea of putting it back into an IMF forum was not at all acceptable. So 20 finance ministers who were different from the approximately 20 who sit on the board of the IMF. And basically on the board of the IMF, you have a lot of small countries which are represented. They got pulled out. And some of the larger emerging market countries that otherwise don't sit on the board of the IMF were put in. Well, this group met every year. And President Bush in 2008 convened a meeting of these countries at the summit level because that crisis was felt to be really serious and requiring much more than finance minister level intervention. And I think, as Kishore said, in London, there's no doubt that involvement of the leaders made a difference because otherwise there was a lot of different views on whether stimulus policies are good or not good, and certainly different views on whether the IMF needed to be funded. But you know, it can be argued that that was a relatively simpler crisis because it was pretty obvious that the world economy was falling off a cliff and something urgent needed to be done. When it was clear that that immediate collapse had been averted, I mean, everybody sort of slightly heaved a sigh of relief, but then they found that some of the deeper tensions in the global economy reflected in the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, obviously was coming to the boil, led to a crisis in Greece, which wasn't well handled. But around the crisis in Greece was a larger crisis of a number of European countries, which face the very difficult task of adjusting to a crisis situation without the advantage of an exchange rate depreciation. I mean, normally if you have a sovereign debt crisis, the answer is you've got to restrain government spending, bring the fiscal deficit down. That tends to have a contractionary effect on the economy. But the conventional way in which you offset that is by having a depreciation, because then the rest of the world provides you the extra demand you need to offset the domestic contraction. Now, this was not possible in the Eurozone because the countries had all one currency. So what do you do? And I mean, that was the problem of Greece, and it looked like the problem of Ireland and the problem of Spain, Portugal, Italy, and so on. Now, I think in the last 2 years, what has happened is that it's quite clear that we've had a series of alarms. The first alarm was that the Eurozone may not survive, in the sense that the euro might collapse, a lot of countries might leave the euro, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that clearly created a huge amount of financial uncertainty, because the collapse of the Eurozone would have very profound implications on financial structures, financial flows, et cetera. And I think it's probably fair to say that the main thing that the G20 did in looking at this problem was to convey the signal that this is not a problem that requires international funding. This is really a problem that requires the Europeans to put their own house in order, and that there were enough internal resources within the Eurozone to deal with this issue. If the Eurozone had a very extensive system of fiscal burden sharing, that would have happened more or less automatically. They didn't, so something unusual had to be done. And I think the only instrument they had really was the European Central Bank. And once Mario Draghi took over, I think he made the right decision, very similar to what Ben Bernanke was doing in the US, to essentially increase liquidity to avert the fear of an immediate collapse. I think compared to 6 months ago, when most of my friends would have put a certain amount of money on the proposition that the euro can't survive, today the perception is, well, you know, I think it'll manage and maybe the zone won't collapse, etc. But the problem of the sovereign debt crisis hasn't gone away. So actually what I think we now likely to see is that maybe the Eurozone will survive. There could be some small countries that may or may not leave, but the zone as a whole will survive. But there is very little prospect of very good growth in Europe. So I mean, there are any number of experts on the state of the world economy that make forecasts of global growth, and there's not much point. I mean, I'm not one, and even if I pretended to be, there's not much point adding yet another set of numbers. So I'll just sort of summarize how I read other people's forecasts. And I think the bottom line is that in the very short run, most people expect to see a short recession in Europe in the year 2012 and a somewhat weak recovery thereafter. The United States will put a better performance than Europe, but still not particularly strong. Both of them still have very serious debt problems, and it's not at all clear that in any of these countries, the requirements to put in place a corrective mechanism which would bring the debt problem under control are actually there. And part of the problem, quite frankly, is that if growth is going to be very weak, it's very difficult to get out of a debt problem unless you are willing to have some very drastic fiscal contraction, which almost nobody thinks is a good idea right now. So you have these formulae which say, well, don't do anything now, but in the medium term, you better do something. So this is what used to be called the St. Augustine defense. So, Lord, make me chaste, but not just yet. This is a consensus on this issue, but it's very difficult to determine what are the policies that are consistent with that. And I would say that if you look at, whether you look at the United States or you look at Europe, very few people are actually willing to say that the fiscal cum growth prospects are well set for a steady improvement in the overall sovereign debt situation. Now, given that, what are the implications for the developing world, which is obviously where we are, in a way, much more interested? Clearly, exports are not going to be doing as well as one might have hoped. Normally, this would, sorry, I should add one more thing, and that is that the fractured nature of the financial system, particularly in Europe, is causing another set of problems. Because on the one hand, these banks need to be recapitalized if they're going to take the losses, which they more or less have to take, on their debt holdings, which are not worth what their market value, where their face value is. And if they're going to have to be recapitalized, that's going to put a strain on the fiscal deficit anyway. Along with that, you've got a whole lot of financial regulatory changes which are designed to bolster up capital requirements and limit leveraging. So there's a serious danger of deleveraging in the European financial system, which in practice will actually mean that the flow of lending from European banks to non-Europe, and that also means the emerging market countries, is likely to be relatively low. Now, it's a bit of a contradiction because I've talked to chairman of or local chairman of international banks in India, and they've often told me that when faced with a problem from headquarters, you get the instruction that you must scale down exposure. But very often, I think they're scaling down exposure to entities whose creditworthiness is actually better than the creditworthiness of the entities for whom they're maintaining exposure. And it's quite normal in countries that the first thing you scale down is foreign exposure. But the net result is, for developing countries, lower exports, also to some extent, to the extent to which this spreads into the Middle East, lower remittances, certainly lower earnings and services because of lower tourism, and lower financial flows. That's all negative. So the question is, what can the emerging markets do? Now, I think one very important positive feature of the global economy is that the prospects of growth of the emerging markets is not totally derived from what happens in the industrialized world. I mean, in the old days, or I should say in the very old days, the assumption was that if the industrialized world doesn't do well, the developing world won't do well. I would say in the last 20 years, as a result of normal maturation, catching up, institution building, transformation, etc., most of the emerging markets, and especially in Asia, have seen what I would call an increase in their autonomous growth capacity. So their underlying autonomous growth capacity has increased. But of course, they're still subject to cyclical variations of what happens in the global economy. So I don't subscribe to the extreme view that emerging markets have delinked from the industrialized countries. But it is true that other things being the same, their underlying trend growth rate has improved. And of course, if the world economy is in very good shape, then they'll do even better. And if the world economy is not in good shape, they'll do worse than their underlying trend. It's clear that in this sort of environment, those countries that were heavily dependent on exports are likely to be hit a little bit more than countries that are not heavily dependent on exports. And this is perhaps one factor which, in India's case, slightly moderates the negative effect of adverse international development. I mean, I want to emphasize that I don't for one second subscribe to the view that having low integration is good, or that our integration is so low that the rest of the world doesn't matter. The truth is we've become much more integrated, which is good, and therefore the slowing down will affect India. It already has affected India. Not as much as the Economist cover suggests, but it has affected India. But we do need to ask the question, and that would be common to all developing countries, that given a situation where demand in the industrialized world for our products is going to be more constrained, what is it that we can do? Now, before I come to India, and I will come to India in this situation, I want to sort of make a few remarks about the G20. I mean, if that's the situation, what do we expect the G20 to do? One of the problems is that when the world was falling off a cliff, It was rather obvious what needed to be done. In the London summit, it was the US that gave the lead, and I think Europeans actually accepted that, and we very rapidly reached a conclusion. Right now, it's a very peculiar situation in which there's not one big fracture in the system. A large number of things are broken. And some of the major industrialized countries themselves are not actually in a position where they can say, well, look, everything's okay here, but it's really the rest of the world that's presenting a problem. The G20, about 2 years ago, had recognized, and I think Kishore's image of being in separate cabins on the same boat, but not having a captain or a crew is a good one. So one contribution that the G20 thought they would make is to introduce a system called the Mutual Assessment process. Now, this was going to be looking at the G20 countries and doing a more in-depth analysis of the policy implications of the global policy implications of wanting to reach a desirable global conclusion in terms of strong, sustainable growth. What are the policy conclusions for each of the G20 countries? The mutual assessment process looks at what countries should do and gives a particularly hard look at 7 countries that have been deemed to be systemic. And that includes the larger industrialized countries, and it includes China and includes India. So the idea is that looking at the world, the G20 would, among themselves, reach some consensus on what are the policy imperatives for these countries, and somehow through a process of peer review and peer pressure, if you like, bring about a better understanding of what needs to be done. Now, the G20 is not a negotiating forum. So since they're not handing out money in order to be eligible for which you have to do something, it's more like conducting a discussion and agreeing that, yes, this is indeed what we need to do, and then somehow either finding this as the basis for convincing yourself, or even another view is you go back and persuade your own constituencies that, look, this is what the whole world thinks, and it's not just we who have to do these things. Many other countries are going to be doing tough things, and therefore we're not the only ones. And somehow you create a greater collective willingness to take some tough actions. Now, what are these policy conclusions that are coming out? Of course, properly speaking, this is something that will be known by the time the next G20 summit takes place in Los Cabos. But I mean, from the work that's been done already, the general picture that does emerge is that for countries like the United States, what they would expect is action over the medium term to produce a credible move on the fiscal front, which essentially puts the sovereign debt to GDP ratio on a more sustainable basis. Now, this is not an easy, and as you can see, anyone reading the newspapers, getting budgets passed in the United States is not an easy process. It's a highly politicized, and they're in fact finding it much more difficult than has traditionally been the case. But here the presumption is that somehow the G20 will be able to create some kind of a consensus that for the US, this is really the best thing to do. In the case of Europe, obviously there'll be differences between, say, countries like Germany and countries like France and Italy. But if you look at the latter, clearly the focus will be some action to bring the fiscal deficit under control, because the debt to GDP ratios there are very high. This would not be a high priority at all for Germany, which has a surplus. But the focus in Europe will be structural reforms. And this is very much what used to be said about developing countries during the days of the Washington Consensus, that you have too many structural rigidities, and if you take care of these structural rigidities in the system, bring about all kinds of reforms, including in the labor market, in licensing, product regulations, service regulations, etc., you will unleash a lot of productivity increases, which will lead to a revival of growth. But to translate that into a domestic political environment is actually not easy, because you're dealing with a situation where in the short run, growth is going to be very low. Now, from a developing country perspective, the idea of having the sort of income that Mediterranean countries do in that climate and not having growth is not necessarily, doesn't look like all that terrible a thing. But actually, when you look at what's happening in these countries, the low growth is associated with unemployment rates that are well above 10%. And what is worse is that the fiscal consolidation is going to be seen by large numbers of people as a progressive erosion of the welfare state safety net, which has for a long time been the essential social underpinning of the political consensus. So it's not an easy job for governments having gone to the G20 and said, yes, we must do structural reforms, sort of settle to land at home and actually do it. Now, if this structural reform could produce results within 1 year or 2 years, that might even be something that is conceivable would get done. But most people think that while structural reforms are important, the results of these structural reforms really manifest themselves over a much longer period. And during that process, it's not actually clear that the political consensus remains strong. I mean, in the middle of a crisis, you might have a political consensus, we've got to do something. But when that something involves unemployment rates that remain high for several years, the political consensus can easily evaporate. Now, this is the kind of challenge that the G20 has to face. And I don't want to predict whether they'll be able to do a good job, but I do want to say that it's a little unfair to expect that they can solve this problem very easily. In fact, in my view, the most important things that they could do is to do the things which require international support. And where the solution dominantly lies in the countries fixing themselves, other than providing guidance, peer pressure, and outside applause, there's not much that the G20 can do. But there are things that actually require international support. And probably in the financial world, the most important of those would be to make sure that the IMF has the resources needed to, as it were, deal with the spillover effects of what is currently a European crisis. So if you start off with the assumption that the financing needs of Europe can come from within, that the structural change that Europe has to do has to come from within. But if Europe is going to grow very slowly, it might have an impact on the rest of the world. And maybe the rest of the world, you need to build a firewall around Europe so that the problems internal to Europe don't necessarily spill over. And that has some implications as to how much resources does the IMF need to do that. So one of the big issues that the G20 has to focus on is what is going to be the role of the IMF in Europe. Certainly our view in India is that the IMF does have a role in Europe. It has the role of essentially making sure that European policy is internally consistent and that an adequate use has been made of internal resources, but that supplementary resources, if necessary, to support a policy program that is otherwise appropriate should be delivered by the IMF. Now, this means that the IMF has to certify whether enough is being done domestically in terms of policies and also in terms of internal resources. And if enough is being done, but some additional support is needed, then of course the IMF has to be ready to provide that support. And currently, there's a lot of discussion going on does the IMF need more money than it already has in order to do this or not. And this is something that is still to get resolved. I don't think there's agreement on it. Some people feel that yes, it does. Others feel that all that is necessary could probably come from the IMF itself, from the Europeans themselves, with only very marginal amounts needed for the fund. And I think in the next couple of years, this will play out. So now, for my last 5 minutes, let me just talk about how India is going to handle this problem. Now, you know, we enter into this period with a background of pretty strong growth up to about 2008. I mean, India grew at about 9% on average up to 2008, was hit by the financial crisis like everyone else, slowed down in 2009, recovered again in 2010. We thought that recovery would continue into 2011, but like everybody else, 2011 also saw a slowdown. So having grown at 8.4% in the year 2009, 2010, or rather 2010, 2011, in the year 2011, 2012, which just ended 3 or 4 days ago, the economy slowed down to 7%. Now, if you look at the economist figure, it would suggest that India grew at 0%, but actually it's a slowdown to 7%, which still makes it one of the fastest growing countries around. But it is still, in the previous year, I think to be fair, quarter by quarter has been decelerating. So the real issue is, what is our prospect for 2012? Well, internally, the government's own projections contained in the recent budget are that the economy will grow at 7.6%. In other words, it will pick up from the 7% level. I should say that even the IMF thinks that India will do better next year. So that the notion that we may turn the corner is not all that surprising. But of course, looking further ahead, the real issue is how fast can India grow over the next 5 years or so. I mean, at one time, we had hoped that we would set a target for the 12th five-year plan, which begins now, to average 9%. We're now looking at whether that's still feasible over a 5-year period, but clearly for this year it won't be, and even for next year it won't be 9%. So to achieve 9% is going to require really some humongous effort, and a lot depends on what happens on the global economy, none of which looks very positive right now. So in this environment, what is our challenge? Well, I think our challenge really is, clearly we have to recognize that exports will be lower. We have to recognize that if we want to sustain a more rapid growth of GDP, we need to address a lot of supply-side constraints, and I think those are the real constraints in India. I believe that if we can address the supply-side constraints, especially on infrastructure, that India has the capacity to grow somewhere between 8 and 9% for several years. I mean, simply a normal catching up process, which we've seen other countries also do. It will require a big step up in investment. It will require running a current account deficit. I mean, that's going to be the principal imbalance generated by the fact that the global economy is not going to grow very rapidly. So, you know, whereas during the period before the crisis, India on average had a current account deficit of about 1% of GDP. In the next 4 or 5 years, we probably need to finance a current account deficit closer to 3% of GDP. So there's a significant deterioration, if you like, on the current account. But the key assumption here is that India is underinvested in. If you look at most developing countries, partly because we opened up later, the inflow of foreign investment in India as a percent of GDP, given the size of the market and all the rest of it, is actually improved quite a bit, but the cumulative investment is still relatively low. So to argue that India can finance a current account deficit of 3% of GDP, relying on internal growth, relying on good macroeconomic management, and basically relying on the fact that there aren't too many countries in the world capable of growing at that rate, is not an impossible task. I want to just, before I conclude, make one other point, and that goes back to the G20. You know, when the world is faced with a clear slowing down and a clear difficult situation regarding growth of many countries, one of the obvious things which traditional approaches to economic growth would point to is trade as an instrument of stimulating growth. So if you look at it from that point of view, giving a momentum to the Doha round could be viewed as, I mean, would traditionally have been viewed as one of the high priority things that the G20 should do. But this is another big challenge because the Doha round at the moment is irretrievably stuck. The G20 did, to their credit, decide that the trade ministers of the G20 will meet in April, and I think a meeting is scheduled a few days from now. They would discuss what is happening in the Doha round, and is there some possibility within the G20 of evolving a consensus to move the Doha round forward. If they can do that, I think it would really be a very major contribution. But whether they can do that or not is a matter of speculation. We'll know before the next summit takes place. And as a last sentence, one of the other big issues on the global horizon is, of course, how you handle problems of climate change. As in the case of Doha, also, therefore, in the case of climate change, there are normal fora where these things are being handled. One is, of course, the WTO. In the case of climate change, the UNFCCC. So I think one of the questions about the G20 is it going to remain primarily in the economic financial area that it will be doing its stuff, or will it become a leaders forum that pulls out from other areas where movement has got stuck and try to resolve it? This is actually a very open question because there's a lot of resistance to any such efforts. But I think as the G20 move forward, whether they're able to do this or not is going to be an interesting indicator of how effective it is as a global forum. Of one thing I would say I'm quite clear. Simply viewing the G20 as the successor to and the democratization of the G8, it was not only unavoidable, but overdue. And I mean, it's impossible to think that stepping back from the G20 and going back to the G8 would be a solution. So it's really a big challenge whether they can live up to the expectations that having gone beyond the G8, will they be able to demonstrate that as a forum, they're useful in generating a consensus on what to do. I think I've run out of time, and Kishore is getting quite agitated without seeming to. So Kishore, over to you.
Thank you, Montek. You were right on time. Brilliant. Now, I get the privilege of asking the first difficult question. And then the rest of you, please prepare your difficult questions. When I was in Davos in January, my counterpart in Harvard, Dean David Elwood, said, when you stand up to ask a question, remember three things. Firstly, state your name, where you come from. Secondly, make a very brief statement. And thirdly, end it with a question mark. So I'm going to do that now for you. As you know, in London, when the G20 met, among the things that they decided in terms of trying to change the world order, they said we must, from now on, choose the leaders of IMF and World Bank on the basis of merit, and may the best candidate in the world become the leader of the World Bank, and let it not be the preserve of any particular countries. As you know, Asia's choice is Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. We're sorry, don't you all agree? Unfortunately, I don't know why you're not a candidate, but if you could tell us, how do we get the G20 to implement a recommendation that it made that leaders should be chosen on merit and not on the basis of nationality?
Well, by the way, the G20 would probably say that they are being chosen on merit. Now, whenever you have an election, there are always a large number of people who feel that the end result was not meritorious. But there has been a difference. I mean, in the past, there was no contest. I mean, there was sort of an understanding. The Europeans would nominate someone, and the Americans would accept, and the board would approve. In the case of the World Bank, it was the other way around. I mean, the US would nominate someone, and that would be it. This time, for both the elections, you have had competing candidates, and countries have voted. So I don't know that the test of a process, if the test of a process is that the candidate who's selected should not be of a particular nationality, that's not exactly the same as saying meritorious, meritocratic, or whatever. I do think that the fact that you now compete that there are alternative candidates. Any executive director can put forward the name of a candidate. And I don't know about the IMF, but the World Bank, I think, has worked out an arrangement which is a little more structured. Anybody can propose anybody meaning any executive director, can propose a candidate, and if there are more than 3, then the board will produce a short list, and then countries will vote.
But it's not one country, one vote. And the voting system is such that the United States has 17% of the vote.
Yes.
Europe has 34%.
Yes.
Australia, New Zealand, Canada have 2-3%, and so they have 51% locked up already.
No, but that's a very valid, and important issue. And that issue can only be resolved by changing voting shares. Which
how do you do that?
Well, at the moment, the sad fact is that we did agree, all of us, to change the voting shares, the quota shares in the IMF, but the shares that were agreed have yet to be actually ratified. So the last agreed change in the voting shares, quota shares translates into voting shares, has not yet been fully implemented. It will be, but it's taking a lot of time. To move, over time, I've no doubt that over time, basically the developing countries' economic weight has to be reflected in the actual voting shares that they have. At the moment, the industrialized countries would say that their voting share is more than their economic weight, because we're not a majority. Our GDP is not 50% of the world yet. But as it gets there, I think the voting shares have to adjust. There's no doubt about it.
Great. Okay. Questions from the floor, please. Just come to the mic. Introduce yourself. Short, sharp question.
Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Rohit Bahl. I am from Bombay and now I've chosen to become a resident of Singapore for similar weather conditions. My question is about the supply-demand issue you mentioned just towards the close. You said there's no shortage of demand in India. The issue is more on the supply side, and you addressed infrastructure as a hindrance to fulfill the supply-demand balance. And you said attracting investment is the way forward. How would you attract investment infrastructure, given, for example, a U-turn on retail, which happened a few months ago? IKEA was ready with $1 billion, but India changed their policy again. So,
well, I think we should not link what I said. Infrastructure doesn't necessarily relate to the policy on retail. By the way, my personal view is, and being publicly stated, that we should change the policy on retail. You know very well that, in a coalition government, very often you have to deal with coalition pressures. The government did announce that they were going to do it. One of the constituent parties had reservations, so they said, well, we're not reversing this decision, but we are holding back its implementation until we've got a consensus. So let's just hope that, a little bit later that consensus would be reached. I don't think, however, when I talk about infrastructure, it hangs on this retail issue. I think the real point about infrastructure in India is a sharp contrast to China. China built infrastructure way ahead of what it needed. So it has infrastructure enough for the next 10 years of growth almost. India doesn't have the infrastructure needed even for its present level of GDP. So we have a big task to put in more investment into infrastructure. I think what's holding up progress, and by the way, we are doing that in the sense that the rate of generation of investment in infrastructure is picking up. It's below what we would want as a target, but it's a lot better than it was earlier. So the question is, what is it that's holding that up? There are several factors which I would call project implementation issues, issues of getting government clearances, environmental issues, forest clearance related issues, which in India and in our political environment can get very sort of controversial. Well, that's our environment and we have to deal with it somehow. But that's what the government is actually focusing on. I believe that if in the next 6 or 8 months or so, if people clearly see that these implementation bottlenecks are quickly getting removed and some large projects are moving forward, I think the perception of investors that India really is on the move will actually change. And the front page of The Economist will then be seen to be a somewhat exaggerated presentation.
I think your phone is on, you know. Your phone is transmitting signals to the... Okay, please, yes, go ahead.
My name is Nabil Al-Sabah. I am a PhD student.
Where?
University of Bamberg, and now I'm here at NUS for 1 year.
Yeah.
In Germany, sorry, Bamberg in Germany.
Yeah.
My question is about the article of The Economist Professor Mahbubani mentioned. The main point is that you have always elections in India, and this makes the political system so complicated that important reforms are not getting implemented. So this is the reason why they think that India's future, the future of the Indian economy, is a little bit grim. So I would like, what's your opinion on that? Thank you.
No,
How do you stop having elections in India?
I don't know actually whether The Economist wants us to stop having elections or to carry on having elections, but not to let elections, not to let good policy become a hostage to elections. And then clearly we have to do the latter. You know, I think you've got to remember that countries go through periods when controversies get maximized. And right now, controversies in India are absolute maximum. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. I mean, we're a poor country. We are a highly pluralistic country, any number of religions, languages, states, etc. We're going through a democratic process at a much lower level of income per capita than any other democracy has done, and with a very, very sort of all-pervasive media, including electronic media, which is sort of constantly bringing one or the other aspect of fact, problem, etc., to the fore. Now, I mean, a democracy is an adversarial form of government. It's a complete mistake to think that a democracy is a consultative form of government where everybody sits around and says, you know, I think on the whole, yeah, it's pretty good policy, but frankly, I would do a better job than you, but it's a good policy, and since you're in government, you do it. That's not the way it works. I mean, the way it works is that whatever you do, it's the job of the opposition to say this is ridiculous, you're incompetent, if you can get away with it, you're corrupt, etc., etc. And you appeal to the public that, you know, these guys are really not going to be able to do it, right? That's what a vibrant democracy does. And incidentally, I do believe that serves some useful purpose of letting off steam. It's absolutely impossible. It's absolutely impossible in India for anyone to feel that the government is getting away with what it wants, because it's quite visible that, you know, whenever people have problems, they're brought to the fore and they have to be listened to. Now, I agree with you that as a result, decision-making gets delayed. But, you know, if you view this as something that happens in phases, right now I think we're going through a very highly sort of accentuated phase where the press is very keen to bring out all these problems, bring to the notice of the public any aspect where the government is found wanting. There'll be periods, you know, where this is not so, and then you get a lot of reforms done very quickly. So I think you need to, so to speak, ride with the tide. But I can assure you that nobody in India feels that the problem is democracy. I don't think we want it any other way, that's for sure. And personally, I think we're right on that, basically. And you know, the other thing I want to mention is that all these people who yearn for strong governments, there have been periods in India when we had strong governments, and we had a growth rate of 3.5%. So during this period when we've had coalition governments, etc., the growth rate has been between 7 and 8%. So I think the problem with The Economist is that it draws a graph for the second fastest growing large economy. The graph goes down to 0. Now that I regard as a ridiculous misrepresentation of the fact. But we have a good relationship with The Economist, so you know
You're a very forgiving type.
What? Yeah, absolutely.
Next question.
So my name is Anshu Lelavadi. I am a resident of Bombay, and I'm studying at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I had two very brief questions. The first was that in the G20 summit that was held, India's key point was, one of the key points pertained to our tax exchange information agreements, where our tax exchange information agreements, where we spoke of, having tax information agreements with the Cayman Islands, and we've just signed one 2 months back. But if you look at the details, these seem very, I don't see them as actually, curbing issues pertaining to tax evasion and corruption. So do you think these are going to be really effective, or are they just, means of appeasing people, given the fact that now corruption is a big issue in India? The second pertains to something more generic and institutional. I believe in the 70s, India had something like an industrial management pool where the bureaucracy tapped the private sector for talent. Are civil service reforms ever going to see the light of day in India? I mean, given the fact that when we have one policy coming out, we have 3 different ministers quoting 3 different figures as far as benefits are concerned, when ideally the black box of policy making in the country should have the same figure. The issue of human capital in the civil service.
Yeah, no, actually on the tax exchange treaties, I mean, we're working to establish templates, and I think they will help, though very often people's interpretation, I mean, other countries' interpretation of how much information they can share can differ from yours. So most countries will only share information if you've taken certain steps to establish that the person concerned is a tax defaulter. They will not encourage fishing expeditions, for example, and that's only fair. So I would not say that the tax treaties we've signed are not actually different substantively from other tax treaties. How effective they are in practice, we'll just have to see. But it's a good thing that, I mean, we're keen on doing that. There's a lot of pressure domestically that we ought to be able to block all these loopholes, and that's why we're doing what we're doing. On the issue of bringing in expertise into government, I think that's a very important point. We are, of course, doing more than we used to, and we've had some very distinguished representatives from the private sector come into government at a high level. But personally, I agree with you that we need flexibility in both directions. I mean, we need to think about bringing in people from the private sector to serve in government. You can, in the role of consultants and so on, and certainly in the Planning Commission, we try to do a lot of that, but in other ministries, that's not happening as much as it should. And I think it needs to be combined with civil servants being given leave to go off and work in the private sector. Now, actually, in our rules at present, civil servants are allowed to go off and work for international organizations, but not to go off, and to go off and work for non-profit civil society organizations, but not to work for the private sector. So I think I agree that these things have to break down. There's no doubt about that.
Thank you. Okay, over there, then next over here. Go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Montag and Dean Kishore. Vivian Liu from Philanthropy Works and World Bank alum as well. So my question is, if you were to compare India to a person and think solely in terms of personality and character traits, what would be India's key strength and weakness? And may I also invite you to do the same for Singapore? Thank you.
So what is your personality strength and weakness?
India's strengths and weaknesses? Well, that's sort of like summarizing a lifetime's experience in one sentence. Let me first say it's a very good question. I mean, usually you say that as a prelude to not giving a very good answer.
He's an honest man.
I'll only say that India has many strengths, but I'm afraid it also has many weaknesses. But I do think that you need to look. I wouldn't describe the system in India as having reached a level of maturation. There's a lot of on the political and institutional side. There's a lot of structural change that's taking place in India. I think there's too much of a tendency to look at the state of Indian policy making by looking at whatever's going on in the central government. Whereas actually the whole logic of economic liberalization and also political decentralization is that a lot of the energy and a lot of the action is outside the government and also outside the central government. So what we've got is a huge variety of states which are performing quite differently, and where if you tried to get a sense of the energy in India, and you viewed that as the sum total of what a lot of individuals are doing, I think you'd get a very, very positive picture. If you tried to look for order, consistency, clarity, and ministers using the same numbers, we get a very bad picture. But you know, order, clarity, ministers using the same numbers, not really that important, all said and done. I mean, if we are very clear what government should be doing, and I think in the past we've not been adequately clear, but I think that is now increasingly becoming clear. I mean, if you look at our own plans, I mean, what do we want the government to do? We want it to deliver infrastructure. So if it's not delivering, it's not doing a good job. We want to do a much better job of health and education, a much better job of delivering drinking water and sanitation. Frankly, that and of course law and order and so on in general, that's 85% of the job of government. And a lot of this is done not by the central government, but really by state governments. So the story varies across states. And I mean, no single person in India is in charge of all of this. It's just that, it's that sort of decentralized system. That's not to say, by the way, that everything's working wonderfully. There are many, I mean, one of the things about India is if you look at the worst of whatever is happening, the picture would be terrible. But at the same time, there's a lot of good things going on, and you need to keep the balance. It's difficult to keep the balance if somebody says, you know, India's in the news, why don't you fly in there for 2 days and write me an article? What happens then is people go to New Delhi, and you know, there's an unwritten rule in India that all the controversies in the country swirl around in a circle with a radius of 25 kilometers around the government buildings of New Delhi. So if you do that, you'll be overwhelmed. But I think if you took a stroll through the country at more leisure, I think you'll be struck by lots and lots of good things that are happening. And I think the task of government really is to create an environment where this builds up a momentum of its own. And it's not something that can be easily directed, either by state governments or by the central government.
By the way, you may have suggested an answer to India's economic growth problems, you know. Because if you can bottle up all the political energy in India and transform it into economic energy, you'll be the fastest growing country in the world. Please.
Surya from ISAS here in Singapore, and until recently I was an Indian journalist in Singapore. So the question is, recently the BRICS summit, you know, there was some mention of having a new South-South Development Bank or something to that effect. Would you put that in the global context of the G20 context, instead of viewing it just as a fortress developing countries or something like a firewall for the emerging economies? Thank you.
Well, you know, it's, I think what the G20, what the BRICS summit said was that there has been this idea. It's been floating around in different contexts. Nick Stern and Joe Stiglitz, for example, had prepared papers supporting it. And I think the BRICS summit essentially said that there is a role for official development financing. I mean, this is a very fundamental point, that prior to the financial crisis, the view in the industrialized world, I mean, you know, pretty widely held, was that while there's a role for aid for poor countries, it wasn't clear what role there was for development finance on market terms. Because the belief was that the private sector is so all-knowing and so perfect that if there's any worthwhile financeable project in an otherwise credit-worthy country, the private sector would finance it anyway. Therefore, why bother about the World Bank? Now, the point is we know from the outcome of the financial crisis, and also what I mentioned, the deleveraging that is almost certainly going to take place, that to expect a lot of development financing to flow from the private financial system, you cannot be as optimistic about it as you might have been 3 or 4 years ago. The logical consequence of that is that the capital base of the World Bank and the multilateral development banks should be expanded. Logically, that would also be the occasion to rebalance voting share. because it's quite possible that the industrialized countries don't want to contribute. Well, the developing countries who want to control these things or have more control could be asked to contribute more. We have on a number of occasions in the G20 argued for significant increase in capital, for example, of the World Bank. Now, I don't remember the numbers exactly, but I am told that given all the sort of constraints, that the World Bank's lending within a year or two will be in real terms equal to what it was 10 years ago. So it's certainly the case that there is no willingness to expand the lending of the World Bank commensurate with the growth of the world economy, the growth of emerging markets, the growth of financing needs. We feel that financing infrastructure is absolutely essential, and in that context, the BRICS summit said, well, maybe it's a good idea to have a bank promoted by emerging markets. It's not just BRICS, and nor is it necessarily going to exclude industrialized countries. I mean, that's an open issue. They could very easily have a system where you have a certain distribution of voting share, where if industrialized countries want to have a say in the management of the bank or the policies of the bank, they could, but they would be a minority, not what they are at the moment. So I think that there is a possible role for a new institution which could become a vehicle for channeling a lot of money into infrastructure. It would not be an aid institution. It would have to be funding viable forms of infrastructure. And what they've done is they've asked the finance ministers to examine its technical feasibility. So it's only a first stage kind of, let's see if it's possible. I saw in the newspapers that Bob Zoellick, the outgoing president of the World Bank, said the World Bank stood ready to partner with this institution. Of course, Bob is outgoing, so I don't know what the incoming president will say. But, you know.
A mutual friend of ours was here recently, a former vice president of World Bank, Danny Leipziger.
Mm-hmm, yes.
And Danny explained to me quite well why the World Bank cannot increase its lending. He said for the World Bank to increase its lending, it's got to ask for greater capital infusion. He says the United States delegation to the World Bank cannot get any more money from the US Congress. And because the US delegation cannot get any more money from the US Congress, the US is blocking any increase in allocation of funds to the World Bank, and therefore the World Bank's growth is being controlled by the US Congress.
No, but I mean, even if the US doesn't want to contribute, implicit in what he's saying is that if the US can't maintain its share,
that's right.
It doesn't want the total to expand.
Exactly, because if you increase the share of others, the US falls below 17%, falls below 15%, it loses its veto power.
Yeah.
That's what, okay, please.
My name is Karthik, a student at the Kuan School of Public Policy. I'm from India. The Planning Commission itself would seem a vestige of the pre-liberalized, phase of India. So, in the sense that everything was, centrally governed, one government dictated what needed to be done, how much steel to be produced, how much electricity to be produced. But some of those elements are still there in India today, For example, the allocation of natural gas to the various sectors, how much it should be priced at, coal, you can look at many sectors. So do you see a reform in the way the Planning Commission sort of sets out these targets and a direction in which the Planning Commission should move for it to be more effective, and be less apologetic in the midterm appraisal saying this didn't happen because of these reasons that you suggested yourself?
Well,
so
let me say
this
that
question is the Planning Commission a sunrise or sunset organization?
The Planning Commission doesn't do all the wrong things that the government does. So, I mean, there's an image. Even if you go back in history, in the days when we weren't even arguing for a market economy, actually the controlling, the licensing, and all of this was being done by the ministries. The Planning Commission was only providing the intellectual justification for doing it, right? The first thing is we're not doing that anymore. Actually, we're strongly in favor. In fact, what we say is that the quantitative allocation of government resources should be prioritizing health, education, these non-market kind of things, drinking water, sanitation, and infrastructure development. In fact, our view is that government resources must go into those kinds of infrastructure where you can't get the private sector to come in. But the experience of the last several years is that in many areas, you can get the private sector to come in, though often you have to do it on the basis of a capital subsidy. I mean, the revenue model won't sustain private investment by itself. So we were actually one of the leading institutions within the country pushing for the adoption of PPP, but in a manner where the concessions would be awarded in a competitive manner. I mean, for example, you can get private investment to construct a road if the road is tolled, but no toll rate will actually completely cover the cost of building the road, even though the land isn't bought by the toll owners, it's already there with the government. So what we do is we say, well, look, we are willing to accept a capital subsidy of up to 40% of the estimated capital cost, and qualified bidders can bid for the subsidy they want. And depending on the road projects, in some cases, we've got negative bids, i.e. the guys are willing to give you the money if you let them build the road and toll it. In other cases, they say they're willing to do that, but they ask you to give them some amount of money. And as long as it's a competitive process, that's fine. And we've had quite good experience. Once again, targets, achievement is below targets, but is much more than what most critics thought we would do. And the World Bank, for example, has recently said that India has the largest number of PPP projects in infrastructure at present. So that's what the Planning Commission is actually not the one doing these controls. All these allocations, energy, for example, I mean, it's our view that we ought to be having a shift to a much more market-related system of energy pricing. But we can say that, and I mean, it has some value. We put it into policy documents. Hopefully, it'll make people think again. And then the difficult problem is implementation. Politicians very often tell me that, the problem is not that we don't know what to do. The problem is we don't know how to get re-elected if we do it. So, we say all the right things, and we hope that somehow the compulsions of politics will enable them to solve this difficult problem.
Nobody has asked an obvious question here so far. You just come back from the Boa Forum. With India and China being the two fastest growing economies in Asia, what can India and China do more together to reinforce each other's growth?
Well, that's, as you said, I've just come back from the Boa Forum, and that's quite interesting, actually, to see a forum located in China with lots and lots of spokesmen from China. India and China do perceive, and our own policy is one of maximizing economic cooperation between the two countries. I'm the co-chair, along with Chang Peng, who's the head of the NDRC, of something called the India-China Strategic Economic Dialogue. Mm-hmm. And we
How often do you meet?
We met, for the first meeting was last year. Then I met him on the sidelines of the BRICS summit just 2 weeks ago. And we've scheduled the second meeting this coming November. But in the meantime, we've identified 4 areas. Areas where we know we're interested, and we know that they're important for us, they're also important for China. And what we are studying is what are we doing in each of these areas on a common template, so that we would be able to learn from their study exactly what they're doing in the areas, with reference to precisely the questions that we are posing. And it includes things like energy efficiency, development of infrastructure, environment, water, and sort of general policy coordination, et cetera, on how to attract investment. But trade between India and China has grown very rapidly. I mean, this year it was about $74 billion. The year before that, it was $60 billion. Our two leaders had fixed a target of $100 billion by 2015. So if we went from 60 to 74 last year, and we still have 3 years to go, we'll almost certainly exceed the 100 billion target. A lot of investment that we want to promote. Chinese companies are investing in India. Huawei, for example, has quite a big outfit in India. Indian companies are investing in China. I met with a lot of our software people who are in China, doing business. Mahindra and Mahindra, who make tractors, are in China. Bharat Forge, who engage in forgings, they're in China. So we're seeing Indian presence in China, and we're welcoming Chinese presence in India. Trade is expanding. So frankly, in the light of what I was saying earlier, I mean, if the industrialized countries are going to grow slower, but if emerging market countries, for whatever reason, their autonomous growth capacity is higher, we ought to be exploring the options of deepening economic exchange with the faster growing parts of the world. And China is the fastest growing. Hopefully, we will have even more exchange with China. And I think they would find India a very productive, profitable market. And I think they see it that way too.
Great. Last question. Sorry.
Good evening, gentlemen. My name is Ranjana Rao, and I'm a student here at the Lee Kuan Yew School. And I happen to grow up in Delhi myself, so I'm fairly aware of the 25-kilometer radius that you were talking about. My question to you is, subsidy are a big part of bridging the income inequality in India. The proposed Aadhaar, the unique identity project, can it be the game changer to stop the leakages? And what are your views on it?
Which project?
The Aadhaar, the
Aadhaar.
unique identity.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think that's an extremely important project which we are supporting greatly. Directly, the project itself doesn't address issues of income inequality. But what it will do, in our view, is it will hugely improve the efficiency with which a whole variety of services can be delivered to targeted populations. Now, at the moment, Mr. Nilekani is an example of bringing in the private sector into a high level of government. He's the head of the Unique ID Authority. They have actually enrolled about 200 million people already. And by the end of this calendar year, his target is to have 600 million on board. A number of pilot projects are being done in parts of the country, trying to ensure that payments are now made using the Aadhaar platform and mobile connectivity with banks, so that when, for example, in a rural employment program, instead of having to get your wage in cash, or instead of having your wage credited into a bank account and having to go maybe 20 kilometers to a bank in order to the nearest branch, because not every village has a branch in rural India, you're now in a position where with the unique ID number, the Aadhaar number, you can open a kind of a no-frills account in a bank. The wage payment or the old age pension or any government targeted subsidy could be credited to your account. And if you want to draw cash against that account, you would go along to the local shopkeeper in your village, who would typically have registered as a banking correspondent and who would also have a mobile account. With a small mobile thing that can read your thumb impression, you can transfer money from your account to his account and get the cash from him. So actually, when you look at what that does in terms of logistics, it basically makes it unnecessary for a person to waste probably a whole day in going to a bank and getting cash. From the perspective of the poor, in the longer run, the ID number will actually enable all these people to establish a credit track record. I mean, today, if you're in a village in Bihar, you've been regularly paying your cooperative society the debt you owe them. You've been regularly paying the amounts due, etc., and you go off to Mumbai because you decided you have a better job opportunity there. It's very difficult to verify whether you have a good track record or not. But with this thing, if you're paying your utility dues through the system, repaying any credit you've taken through the system, you would be able to authorize any new person to have access to your credit history, which would, for a poor person, establish credit history, which is extremely valuable in getting new credit. So I see a whole lot of things that will happen, which will essentially which will facilitate inclusive growth. People who otherwise get frozen out of the system one way or the other, will be able to get access to it. And I think we'll see this in the next two years, because it's something which the pilots are already working, and they're very successful.
Well, I think we've all been very privileged. We've got fascinating new insights into the challenges facing the global economy, new insights into how the G20 works, and certainly strong new insights into the prospects of the Indian economy. So I'm now convinced that the only way to understand the economist cover is to turn it upside down. And that's the future of the Indian economy, going right up. So thank you very much.
The Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.